On episode 22, way back in 2017, this podcast featured a 1994 scuba diving trip that went awry, with 4 men going into the Gulf, but only 1 coming back. Now, 8.5 years later, we revisit the still unsolved case with a much wider knowledge on water disappearances and new commentary. I'm Ed Dunsel, and this is Unfound. But first, Unfound news. It's the end of the year, so you know what that means, an upcoming update episode. I think I'll have a lot to discuss on the last Friday of this month. Next, I've been asked to take part in a true crime seminar in the United States next year. I've accepted. Where and when? Well, it's a secret for now. Finally, I am back in Florida. I drove back on December 9th. A very easy drive. Except for my car's check engine light coming on. A couple of notes before the 2017 interview with Dave Medot's father starts. Given that Unfound's audience is now much, much larger than it was back then, I'm hoping we have some scuba diving experts, not just amateur enthusiasts, but actually instructors and professionals who can contact me with their insights on this case. I can be reached at unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. The question for that group is very simple. Is Jeff Wandich's story plausible? Also, the reason I picked these disappearances for a revisitation is due to the story that happened while I was in Pennsylvania seeing my dad. A boat capsized about 20 miles offshore from where I live in Clearwater Beach. All 4 men, including a 90-year-old, survived. So why didn't Omar, Kent, and David? I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound Bill Medot, the father of David Medot. Bill, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell the listeners a little bit about your son.
Well, my son David, who was 25 at the time this happened in 1994, is, in my view, a remarkable young man. He was very talented in many respects. He was very outgoing, had a lot of friends. He was doing very well in business in the company he worked for. He had a lot of interests, one of which was diving. So he was a young guy, really with the world in his hand, whatever he wanted to do. So that was a capsule of David.
What company did he work for?
He worked for a company called Magna International that made auto parts for many of the large auto part manufacturers. In fact, built sub-assemblies for them, like dashboards, et cetera, et cetera. And Dave had started there after university actually in a very low position, you might say, as a male boy, and he'd worked his way up into the human relations department, where he would visit different plants that they had and try and resolve whatever issues they had there. So he was doing quite well.
And how did he know Kent Monroe and Omar Shearer?
Well, Omar, Dave has known since they were little boys because they were a neighbor across the backyard and down a few from us. So he had known Omar since he was a little kid, and they went to school together and high school together. So you might say Omar was the one that he knew the best, very, very well. Now, Omar had a friend who was Jeff Wandich's brother, a younger brother. His name was Brad. So that was how Omar really met Jeff, who lived several blocks away. But he knew Jeff through the relationship with Jeff's brother, Brad. And Mumar also was a friend of Kent's, and he had introduced Kent to David about 2 years prior to this, to 1994. So really, I guess the connector in all of these was Omar.
Had the four of them, and let's include Jeff Wandich in this, had David, Kent, Omar, and Jeff ever gone on a getaway together, a vacation together, let's say?
Not the three of them. I mean, David had traveled a few times to Florida with some university friends, and Omar had traveled to, Jamaica and Florida and what have you with other of his friends, and I imagine Kent did. But this was the first time, I think, that they traveled together. And the way that happened was Dave and Kent had been taking some diving lessons in Canada. And Omar was already a bit of a diver, and the three of them were talking and saying, hey, is there someplace we can go to dive? And to make a long story short, Kent said, look, I know this guy Jeff. He's got a place in Florida. We can probably go down and see him, stay at his place. I'll call him. And that's how it all happened.
So all of these young men lined up their work schedules so they could go on vacation together, and they went to Florida. What do you remember knowing about this trip? How long were they going to be here? What did you know about it?
Well, it was only going to be like a 4-day trip, I think a Friday to Monday trip for these guys to come down and maybe do a little diving. And what they were going to do is they were going to fly into Miami, I think, then rent a car and drive over to Marco, where Jeff's spot was, and do their thing there. And my understanding was they were going to dive at some local places, and then come home.
And this place that they were going to stay, this was going to be a condo owned by Jeff Wandich's father. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is correct. A condo in a gated community on Marco Island. Quite a nice place, actually.
So they get here to Florida, and give the listeners an idea of what happened in the next 24 to 36 hours. It started off by them going to a dive shop, didn't it?
Well, my understanding was they got into Miami and might have spent an hour or two in South Beach, and then later on in the afternoon, it might have been the Thursday, I guess, they went over to Marco, met Jeff. Jeff had to escort them in because it's a gated community. And from there, towards the evening, they went into a dive shop that I believe is in Naples called Sealandia, where they picked up tanks, oxygen tanks, and whatever else they needed to complete their equipment for the dive the next day.
What equipment did they bring with them, and what equipment did they have to rent once they got to Florida?
I believe they brought the dive suits with them. Whether I'm not sure about the BCDs, whether they brought that with them or they rented it from Sealandia, but definitely they rented the tanks.
So they rented the tanks and they talked to the people at the dive shop.
Right. Then the next day, they went to the marina to get Jeff's boat. And they got on the boat, took it out, and the boat seemed to be overheating for some reason. And this boat had 2 motors on the back of it. So they went back in and had a mechanic look at it. And the conclusion was there might have been a bag or something caught on one of the engines. Anyways, the problem went away, they were told. And they're also given some replacement parts in case it occurred again. So that set them back an hour or so. They then left the marina, and that's the last time anybody saw them leaving the marina. Now, according to what Jeff told us, they went from there to a place called Ben's Barge, which I think is about 10 miles off the coast, and it's sort of like a sunken ship. So they went there not to dive, but to get some bait fish, because they were also going to fish, apparently. And so they got this bait fish, and once they had this bait fish, they then proceeded, let's say, another 50 miles out on the water to this California Baja wreck, which was a wreck of from the Second World War of a supply ship sunk by a German U-boat. And it was in about 110 feet of water, apparently, with still a lot of the original equipment, jeeps and stuff, still on the deck of the ship. So they proceeded out there. And while they were out there, they, I think, got there 1 o'clock, something like that, supposedly, and they fished for a while, and then around 2:30, they decided to dive this wreck. And so they went down in two pairs. There was Kent and Omar as one pair, and Jeff and Dave as another pair. And they went down to dive the wreck. Now, I think one of the things, and I'm not a diving person, but I guess when you get down 20 to 30 feet, you have to equalize the air in your ears. I guess that means stay in that position for a little while and let your body acclimatize to that. So when they got down to that position, Kent was having trouble making adjustments. And it got to the point where they felt, no, he couldn't go further. So Kent and Omar came back up to the boat, and Jeff and David continued to the bottom to look at the wreck. So they're going up. Jeff and David go down, and they're down on the bottom for about another 10 or 12 minutes, because I think at that depth you can only dive for about 15 minutes in total. And then they come up. In the meantime, again, apparently what happened was when Umar and Kent surfaced, so they've been off the boat, who knows, 5 minutes. They surfaced, they get on the boat, back on the boat. And when they're back on the boat, they suddenly find that this boat is filling up with water somehow. And before they can do anything, try and start the boat, it won't start. Then the boat apparently flips over. I say apparently because this is what we were told.
At this point, I think the listeners need to know that everything that Bill is talking about here is what Jeff Wandich told Bill, the rest of his family, the other families, the Coast Guard, and any other law enforcement agency that was involved in this case, in this disappearance. This is what Jeff Wandich told all of them. There's no proof that any of this is true. It may very well be true. But everything that Bill is saying here is from the mouth of Jeff Wandich, the survivor of this incident. Bill, please continue.
So when Jeff and David reach the surface, they look around and all they see is the bow of the boat, about 3 or 4 feet of it sticking up in the water. The rest is submerged. And they look beyond the boat 50 to 80 yards, and they see Kent and Omar, who, when the boat capsized, they jumped off and they grabbed their BCDs, or buoyancy compensators, and were hanging on to these. So Jeff swam over to them, helped them get their tanks off, because the tanks at this point were weight, and put the buoyancy compensators on, and then, so it's like a life jacket. And then they come back to where the boat is sticking out of the water, where David had gone and had grabbed a line from the boat and was holding on to it. So now we have all 4 of them sort of around the boat, and then the story comes out. Hey, what happened? Tell us what happened. And so what I've just told you is what Jeff said he got from Omar and Kent when they were around the boat.
And the boat was staying in place because the anchor was still anchored to the bottom.
It was anchored to the bottom, right, with the line to the bow. And so there they were. They're having this thing. So now they're saying, all right, here we are. What do we do? And in the process, they did 2 things. One, I guess my son David went down and released. They had a bag of bait fish, right? And they released the bag of bait fish on the theory that the current would carry it away and therefore not attract bigger fish, number one. The second thing that Dave did is he went down, apparently, and tried to look in the console for the flare gun, which he didn't find. So he came back up, and that was the end of that. And they stayed huddled around this boat for about 3 hours. And suddenly, I guess just as night was coming, the boat finally sunk. It went the rest of the way underneath the water and, went straight down to the bottom. David had been had himself tied to the boat with a rope or a line, and he was being pulled down. Jeff said he went under, cut the line to release David, and now the boat goes down. So the four guys are sitting there, and they have no choice at this point but to try and go to a tower. There is a Coast Guard or military tower, I guess you would call it, about 75, 80 feet above the water, about 4 miles away. And there's a series of towers that the military used to use. And it's got a light on it. And they figured that was the only place they could go. So they began swimming towards this tower. So we have these four guys with their life jackets or BCDs on, swimming towards this tower, and it's getting dark. Now, at this point, they start swimming, and I guess it's getting dark, and the waves are 3 to 4 feet. And Jeff sees a light on a boat that he thinks is going to passing within a few hundred yards. And he said two different versions of this. He said, one, he saw lights in the boat. He started to swim towards it for 25 seconds. 30 seconds, then figured he couldn't make it, came to come back, and when he went to come back, the other guys were gone. He couldn't find them in the waves in the dark. Another time, what he has said was that he was really nervous, and he didn't want the guys to see him crying, so he just sort of swam over a wave so he could cry for a second and then come back, and when he went to come back, the guys were there. Anyways, at this point, these guys were no longer visible to him, or he didn't know where they were. So he began swimming towards this tower. And at some point on his swim to the tower, he decided to take off his buoyancy compensator. He thought maybe that was putting drag on him. And so he took that off and kept swimming and swimming and swimming. And eventually he made the tower. So he got to the tower, he climbed up on, there's, I guess, a series of platforms on it, climbed up on a platform. Apparently, now, if you go back in time, of course, no one knows these guys aren't there. It's getting to be 7, 8 o'clock, and all suddenly the family's getting concerned. The family is phoning the Coast Guard. Now, apparently, sometime during the night, a helicopter did come by this tower, but only shone the light in the water, not on the tower. Jeff says they didn't see him and they went away. And thereafter was a number, about 36 more hours until another helicopter came by and looked on the tower and saw Jeff in order to rescue him.
So this was the point at which Kent, Omar, and your son David disappeared. The four of them were at this boat, which is called the Siesta. It sinks, the four of them start swimming, and at some point, Jeff gets separated from the other three by one way or the other. He is the one who makes it to this military tower out there in the Gulf. He climbs up onto the tower. The three other young men don't make it for whatever reason. What happens next?
Well, in the meantime, while this was happening, the Coast Guard sent out some boats and helicopters, and they initially went to the wrong place. Apparently, there's two sunken wrecks out there. One's called the California, the other one's called the California Baja. These guys are on the Baja. The Coast Guard originally went to the Baja itself. Now, this one they went to was about 6 miles away from the previous one, and it took about a day to solve that problem. Now, the only good news about that is the wrong boat was downstream from where the boys were. So in other words, if the current was carrying them, it should have been carrying them sort of more or less towards that location.
Toward the location that was the wrong location.
Right. But then when they found out it was wrong, they went back to the first location and they started, their regular search. And of course, their search consists of many things, like a grid pattern, and they also drop buoys in the water and check them so they can figure out what from time to time what the current strength is, etc. They do a bunch of things like that. So they did that and kept searching. Then they found, like I say, 36 hours Jeff later, and found out the stuff from him what happened. So they continued this search, and over the next several days, we found a lot of stuff from the boat, like a couple of tanks, a milk jug, a bag, a camera bag with a camera in it. This was debris that belonged to Jeff's boat, let's say, and it was all in the current pattern that you would expect, along for about 10 miles or so. So we kind of got proof that a current was flowing in a certain direction, and it would carry things that way. Okay, but in that time, we didn't find anything of the other three guys.
Not a wetsuit, not a BCD, not a diving mask, not even a fin for their feet, nothing like that.
Nothing at all. Yeah, and that was sort of that's the nub of this mystery. Like, why didn't we find anything? When we know the starting point, and we also know that we found other things, right? So that's what was curious about this.
Bill, can you convey to the listeners your side of this? What were you doing at the time? How did you find out that David was missing? Were you worried?
Well, it was, I guess this happened on a Friday, late Friday night. So the Coast Guard, et cetera, was finished their first sweeps, et cetera, by Saturday afternoon. So you might say almost a day after the boys had been missing. And I was just about to take my youngest son, Matthew, who was 17 at the time, to his hockey game when I got a phone call. And the phone call was from Omar's mother, who had been called by Jeff Wantage's people, who had said, hey, these guys are missing. So, I heard that. I was in shock. I just dropped everything, went to the bank, got a bunch of U.S. money while my wife was making me plane reservations. And I believe I was down that night or early in the Sunday morning, can't remember when. So I went right down there then and stayed down there for about 3 weeks.
When you got down here to Florida and you started hearing about some of the details of what happened, and knowing your son's diving expertise, which wasn't lengthy, were you a little surprised how far these young men were out into the Gulf?
Yeah, absolutely. I was shocked. Like, I knew these guys, at least David. He was a very athletic guy, and but he was a new diver. And I figured they'd go somewhere and dive 30, 40 feet of water, probably a couple of miles offshore. When I heard it was, 60 miles and 100 feet, I was just dumbfounded.
So you get down here to Florida. I'm guessing some of the family members of the other young men who disappeared are already here. I think that the Wandich family, Jeff Wandage's parents, were already here as well. What do you remember them saying? What do you remember the law enforcement saying? What do you remember the Coast Guard saying?
Well, what happened is I came into Fort Myers, because Fort Myers is where the Coast Guard station is. And if you know the area, Marcos, 40 or 50 miles from Fort Myers, something like that. So Jeff's people were in Marco, and I really didn't see them till after Jeff was found. I just got a place in Fort Myers, close to the Coast Guard station on Fort Myers Beach, and that's where the other family members came as well. So all in the Ramada Inn there. What was the Ramada Inn there? Going over to the Coast Guard station every few hours to see what the latest was. So that's what we were doing. For the next couple of days, we were in that mode of talking to the Coast Guard. Then Jeff was found. We heard about that, and he went to the hospital, and I think he was at home for a day recuperating. And then he came down, and I'm guessing it was 4 days after this happened, whatever. Came down to where we were in Fort Myers with his family and talked to us for about an hour and kind of recounted the story that I gave to you.
How were you feeling at that time, given what you knew? Were you still hopeful that David and the other two young men were going to be found?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, these other guys, well, my son and the other guys were smart kids. They weren't dumb. They're kind of people you like to have around if you had an emergency. You knew they'd be creative or come up with something if they're, as long as they were capable or healthy. So, yeah, I figured, okay, these guys, compared to the average person, have a better than average chance of hanging on or succeeding or whatever. So I was still thinking, hey, maybe they're still trying to get to that tower, or maybe they decided to stay together to make a big mass on the water for a search. So, yeah, we were quite hopeful then. And a lot of, and around that time, a lot of other speculation came up. Speculation, well, hey, maybe these guys have been eaten by sharks. Maybe they were picked up by somebody else, and therefore aren't there. These sorts of things were bubbling up, along with rumors that, hey, were these guys all involved in some sort of a drug deal? And that's what it was, a drug deal. And there was all kinds of rampant rumors. And so we tried to distill through the facts and track what we could. Like, for example, there was a sea captain who was actually out at the Baja California at midnight that night. So this would have been 4 or 5 hours after the boat finally sunk. But he anchored out by the Baja California, and we talked to him, but he didn't see or hear anything. That's what he said when he was out there. So,
did Jeff ever say anything about a boat pulling up to the wreck and anchoring while he was waiting on that military tower 4 miles away? Because I'm guessing that if he and the other 3 young men could see the tower while they were in the water, then Jeff would be able to see a boat pulling up to the wreck from the tower.
Oh, yeah. Well, Jeff said that he saw 4 or 5 boats, like you call them shrimp boats, going by, but none of them came to the tower, right? But he said he saw 4 or 5 boats, but none of them came by the tower.
The listeners may need to be reminded that you weren't hopeful just because these were young men who were decently physically fit. All of them, if Jeff Wandich is to be believed, all of them were wearing these BCDs, these flotation devices. They look like vests. Actually, they're excellent flotation devices that all scuba divers wear. All 4 of them allegedly had them. And in fact, with those devices, they'd be able to float for a long time, if not forever, even if they weren't alive.
Right. This is exactly why it's mysterious. If these boys are wearing these things, then they got to be on top of the water, sort of alive or dead. They got to be on top of the water. And if they somehow rigged it so they were together, then you have a fairly large mass, okay, compared to some of the stuff we found. So more easily sighted, you might say. And if they weren't together, then you got 3 shots at hitting something. So it did seem that, hey, we're going to spot something. We should be spotting something.
What was the Coast Guard telling you at this time? Were they giving you reasons to be hopeful that David and the 2 other young men would be found? What were they saying?
Well, yeah, I think I had a feeling, they never said this, that they were just a little surprised they didn't find something, because they had their boat out there and helicopters and a couple of planes going by, and they were looking. And then, as I look back now, after 4 or 5, 6 days, they were saying to us, look, we're a search and rescue, meaning not recovery of dead bodies is the meaning I took from that. So when they felt there was no hope they were going to wind things down. Now, we, especially Omar's uncle, we got involved. We tried to dig up some statistics from friends we had on in universities and stuff on hypothermia, et cetera, to present the case to say, look, these guys still could be alive, dehydration and all that taken. There's still a chance there's alive. And I think the Coast Guard then did relent and continue the search for another 2 days, which we really appreciated, by the way, I should add.
Most of the listeners probably don't know this, but I live on the Gulf Coast. I live in Madeira Beach, which is right on the Gulf Coast. Where this disappearance happened is about 3 hours south of where I live now. And I can tell you, I've been in the Gulf of Mexico in November. I wouldn't say that the water is warm, but surely you would not get hypothermia from it within 36 hours. I don't believe. In contrast, I guess the most well-known case is the Titanic, where people went into the water there and died within a few hours because of the water being so cold. So the Coast Guard is continuing to search, but how long did that go before they ended their search? And I know we're going to get into this in part 2, but what was Jeff Wandich saying? Was he taking part in the search?
Well, I think the Coast Guard continues the search, and, I haven't tracked this exactly, but probably 6 days, 7 days, something like that. So in the process, 3 or 4 days into it, I guess once Jeff is back home and sort of recovered a bit.
Yes, maybe we need to talk about that. What condition was Jeff in when the Coast Guard found him?
Well, when I saw him, it's hard to say. He didn't look too bad, but he had a day to recuperate. But apparently he had some sunburn. I don't know if that was from being on the tower or from before he was on the tower, because I didn't see him before. But he didn't appear, to have lasting derogatory effects. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. And when I saw him, I didn't have, he didn't appear to be wiped out, when he came down to see us. And he did, I know, apparently his dad hired a helicopter, I was told. And I think Jeff went out with maybe the guy in the helicopter for a bit. I don't know how long they were out for. And I know that Jeff's father also hired a sea captain, a boat, to go out for a few days to look around, and Jeff started out with that sea captain.
But after they found that flotsam, I guess that's what you call it, that milk jug, the camera case, and some other things, those items you already mentioned, they didn't find anything, did they?
No, after 5 or 6 days, they didn't find any more, and you could argue maybe there wasn't any more to find other than the boat, which also in that period of time, the boat was raised, and it had sunk on top of the California Baja.
Yes, it's probably a good time to talk about that. How did the raising of the boat come about?
Well, what happened is, apparently, you picture this boat is out there, and it's anchored such that the boat itself is, the Siesta is right on top of the California Baja, which is, a few hundred feet long, this boat. And when it sunk, it went straight down. Well, two things happened. When it first sunk into the water, but the bow was still sticking up, some stuff like fishing rods and a tool chest, etc., just fell down on the Baja. Then when the boat itself sunk, it went down and it landed upside down on the Baja. Now, this is also 60 miles out from the coast, so that's international waters. And apparently there's a law that says if something is sunk out there and it's not anchored, then it can be salvaged by anybody. So a salvager by the name of Dave Satterfield from Marco, after several days, he went out there with his crew in his boat, and he went to the bottom and raised the Siesta, from where it was, and brought it up to the top.
He did this on his own. He wasn't asked by the Wandiches to do this. He wasn't asked by the Coast Guard. The salvager found out about a boat sinking and thought, hey, I can make a couple bucks if I go out there and bring it back to the surface.
Exactly. Now, the Coast Guard knew he was going, and they were there watching him. I don't even know if they were filming it, but they didn't do anything. So he brought this, and his crew brought this boat up and towed it, and it was no problem. Once they got it up, it floated, and he towed it into shore. And he also found, I think, a couple of tanks, air tanks that were down there that hadn't been used. So he takes it back to his place in Marco, and immediately starts taking things apart because the engines have been in salt water, right? So apparently if you don't start cleaning them real fast, the engine gets destroyed.
Sure.
So the net effect of that was it kind of destroyed the chain of evidence, if you will, because later on there were questions about Well, were the bilge pumps working? Like, why did it sink? Were the bilge pumps working? Yes or no? Well, the battery was off, but who turned the battery off? Was it off when the boys were out there, or did one of the divers who salvaged the boat, accidentally or otherwise turn them off, the switch, So all that stuff was gone, that potential evidence.
And the reason that is because the sinking was viewed as an accident. In fact, it's viewed as an accident to this day. There was no reason to do any forensics on the boat, for the Coast Guard to go on there and see if everything was working, because they just thought, well, it's just a simple accident. And even more so, they actually thought that your son and the other two men were still going to be found.
Oh, yeah. Like we're just, at least speaking for myself, I'm just an average person who does those things, and I don't look for anything devious or whatever. And I figured, hey, this is just a terrible, tragic event. Let's try and salvage it, Yeah. I wasn't looking for anything otherwise.
I guess what I'm saying is, at the time that the boat was raised, you didn't think that that was unusual, because you thought that your son and the two other young men were going to be found. It's only since then, all these years later, now that they haven't been found, that maybe you look back on that and say, you know what, that boat should have been looked at a little more closely.
At the time, there was something twigging at me. I might be an average guy, but I don't think I'm that stupid. And I'm saying, hey, people are missing here. Boats on the bottom. This guy is raising, a salvager is raising a boat, and the Coast Guard's there. Why isn't the Coast Guard taking it? Like, for all I know, some pirates could have come by and shot the boat full of holes,
Yeah.
So I'm saying to myself, well, why isn't this in custody? But then I'm saying to myself, well, I'm not the Coast Guard. They probably, know what they're doing, or the other powers that be. And, what you find out later is, well, the Coast Guard's got a certain level of jurisdiction, but there's no other law enforcement that has any jurisdiction, with the exception of maybe the FBI. So really, the local people aren't there saying, hey, something's wrong here, let's do it this way or that way. They have no say. So and my feeling was, that was a loose end. It was unfortunate, but...
You are on this program, but there are two other families, the Monroes and the Shearers, who also lost sons. What were they saying at the time? What do you think they were feeling at the time? Do you remember, if you can say, if you feel comfortable talking about that?
They were pretty well as much very similar, I guess, to the way I was seeing things. I know that Kent's sister was very vocal. She was very concerned. She was very hard on the Coast Guard, and then on Jeff. Long before I was looking in either of those directions. They're asking a lot of questions. Fairly blunt questions.
How did you feel about that at the time? Did you think that maybe she was a little out of line, given that you all still thought that Omar, Kent, and David were going to be found?
Yeah, I hate to admit it, but she probably had maybe better instinct than me. I said, holy smokes, I just want to find these guys. I don't want to make waves. I don't want to start accusing the guys who are doing the searching, of not doing their job. Maybe they'll stop. I don't want that. So I would have rather just, hey, just keep looking, etc. And then when we have more facts, then we can decide to say things or not say them. Anyway, so I was a little slow off the mark on that one.
Bill, I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about that. You had to go by what the Coast Guard was saying. You had to believe in them. And in retrospect, I guess they did do as much as they could. But please do not beat yourself up too much about that all these years later. So regarding the search, when did it end, and what did you end up doing after that?
Well, finally we got to a point where the Coast Guard had done their thing, had ended their search, and I had heard that the FBI was going to be involved and look at things. I tried to talk to them. Of course, it's very difficult to talk to the FBI if you're, an average person. but they just say, they'll say, we'll tell you maybe when we'll tell you. So we got to the point of saying, all right, there's not much more we can do here. And also during that time, we were very fortunate in that many, many friends and family had started a fund for us. So we had hired a lot of boats and planes ourselves privately to do this search, over this 2 to 3 weeks. So not only was the Coast Guard searching, we had our own planes and helicopters and boats searching. So after 2 to 3 weeks, that was also done. So we said, hey, we can do better by going back home and working from there. So that's what we did. We packed up and went home.
Do you look back at it now and say that maybe things would have gone a little differently if you had been an American and not Canadian?
No, I think I probably, if I had any difficulty, it probably would have been the same as an average American. In other words, I'm an average guy, an average family, and most Americans are average and average families. If I was John F. Kennedy Jr., I would have had, a lot more resources committed to.
Yes, the plane crash from the late 1990s, of course.
So, I appreciate the help that we did get. Would have liked to have had, even more. But and there was a lot of things we did, but I don't think there was any discrimination against me at all as being a Canadian.
Bill, while you were down here, while the other families were down here, what kind of support did you get from the Fort Myers people, the Marco Island people? I'm talking about just the residents of both of those areas in regards to your son and the other men's disappearance.
Thanks for asking that, Ed, because I really must emphasize that we were overwhelmed at the generosity and support of the people down here. It was just incredible. The local business people and the local people. For example, the Ramada Inn, where we stayed and set up our command post, set up special communications for us and significantly discounted our costs. A local attorney, well-known attorney, handled all our legal affairs gratis, wouldn't accept any payment at all. A local restaurant sent us meals daily. Also, many local people volunteered their boats, their planes in some cases, believe it or not, and even and volunteered to be spotters on the planes and boats that we hired and participate in the search. And I just can't tell you how uplifting that was to all of us at this particular time in our lives. So thanks for asking.
That's great to hear that virtual strangers could give you support, the rest of those families support, in probably the toughest time in all of your lives.
Yeah, that's right. That is absolutely right. And Ed, some of the time when we're talking, I can give you some examples that are interesting that would kind of blow you away.
The Coast Guard completed their search, and at any time at that point, or ever since then, have they ever given you any reason that your son, David, Kent, and Omar were never found?
No. They just said, we normally, expect to find something, but there are cases, sometimes we don't, and this is one of them. We're very sorry about it. We don't, have good reason to continue. That was kind of it. Like we did get, a letter from them, something along those lines, right? So, I really couldn't blame them. As far as any detail, I think it was a year or so later, whenever it was, under the Freedom of Information Act, I asked for the documentation from the Coast Guard, and there was about 2 inches of it, and a lot of it was redacted, but a lot of it was also very directional stuff. Here is the direction we went. Here is the time. Here is the sounding. Here is the current. That sort of stuff. Oh, we found this thing here. We found that thing there. Those sorts of things. So, yeah, they didn't give me a lot of detail, but maybe there wasn't more to give.
I ask because here in the United States we have the NTSB and the FAA, and had this been a different situation where it was a plane crash instead of a boat sinking, that the NTSB would come in and investigate. They investigate any plane crash that happens in the United States. But it doesn't sound like you got any kind of report like that from the Coast Guard in this case. They probably just limited that to big ships, tankers, cruise lines, organizations, companies like that. So you never got any official report?
No, not that I'm aware of, no. And I don't know if that's a practice for when there's a boat issue or not. Or at that time, it was just 22 years ago.
That's a topic I should probably look into, because I do know that the NTSB and the Coast Guard do get together on certain cases, but obviously not small craft like this. But I would think maybe they might get involved if somebody went missing or somebody actually got killed in a boating accident. Myself and the listeners may have to look into that for you. One final point in this part one of this discussion in Vanished in the Gulf. You've been working on this ever since, haven't you? Since your son disappeared in 1994.
Right. Off and on, yes.
And that was the first part of the interview I conducted with Bill Madot regarding the disappearance of his son David, Kent Monroe, and Omar Shearer. You should know that Bill is going to be returning for part 2 next week. Between now and next week, if you choose to look into this case a little bit more, I hope you find that Bill and I covered the facts as unbiasedly as possible. And you should know that's not easy for Bill to do. He's a very passionate advocate for his son, for Kent, for Omar. But I wanted to do it that way because I know most of you are not familiar with this disappearance, and I wanted you to look at it in the most unbiased of ways. Don't worry, next week we're going to get into a little bit more of the particulars. You may even call them contradictions. But in the end, you are the jury. You are going to get to decide whether Jeff Wantich is telling the truth or not. Regarding Jeff Wantich's account of what happened on November 4th, 1994, and given that this is the episode where we defend his story, there are some facts that should be put into evidence that you should keep in mind as you continue to think about this disappearance. Point number 1. I'm going to read off some names to you, and I'm pretty sure you've never heard of any of these men. Timothy Allen Atkins, Edward S. Cody, Victor Marquis Cooper, Charles L. Dillon, Charles Jacob Pershow, Robert Richard Remmer, Barry Vincent Rodden, Ulysses Hanoi Roldan, Corey Dominic Smith. Do you know who all of those people are? They just happen to be all men. These are all men who have gone into the Gulf in the last approximately 30 years and never came back. And these are just the men in the Tampa area. This does not include the area that extends up to Pensacola in the panhandle of Florida. It does not include any names, any people who disappeared in the Gulf going down toward the area of Marco Island and Fort Myers. In each of these cases, these men were out in the Gulf for scuba diving, fishing, and or boating. And looking into every one of these disappearances, I've read the account of each of these disappearances on charleyproject.org. I'm not sure anything suspicious was alleged in any of these cases. In fact, of these disappearances, the one that I found the most interesting was the disappearance of Edward S. Cody. He disappeared offshore scuba diving 9 miles from where I sit right at this second, right off the coast of Madeira Beach, Florida, 9 miles out. His body was never found. And among those 9 names, Edward S. Cody is not the only one who died while scuba diving. There was at least one other case. I forget which one of those men also disappeared during scuba diving. But they were wearing essentially the same equipment that David, Kent, Omar, and Jeff were wearing. These men also disappeared. Of course, Jeff did not disappear. So just because somebody has scuba gear on does not mean that they can easily be found if the Coast Guard goes out and starts to search for a person who had an incident while scuba diving. And reading off that list, we learn that being out in the water, it is a dangerous place. It's much more dangerous for humans to be out on the water than to be on land, just like it's more dangerous to be driving a car than flying in a jet. Look at what happened to that Miami Marlins pitcher Jose Fernandez from last fall. Of course, he had alcohol in him. A toxicology report showed that he also had cocaine in him. But he was out there with 2 other friends and at night, and they ran right into a jetty. All 3 of them got killed. The water can be a dangerous place. And every body of water on Earth has stories of men and women going out there and never coming back. So the disappearance of David Medott, Omar Shearer, and Kent Monroe, if you look at it from that point of view, is not that odd. These things are happening every day all over the earth. Point number 2. The Coast Guard and law enforcement agencies had an opportunity to interview Jeff Wandich when he came back to shore. He sat down with them for many hours, and there's no evidence that the Coast Guard or any of those entities thought Jeff Wandich was lying at all. After he told them what happened, they were satisfied that this was just a horrible accident, even though the Coast Guard never could explain why they couldn't find the 3 other men floating in the Gulf, despite them allegedly having their BCDs on, which means they could have floated for an extended period of time. Days, if not weeks. Yes, Jeff Wandich's story feels a bit incomplete. We don't have all of the answers, but for a person like himself, it was a traumatic experience for him if things happened the way he said they happened. We can maybe compare this to 9/11, those people who were in the World Trade Center towers who managed to survive. Those people will never be the same. And I'm sure if you were to be able to talk to one of them, they would have gaps in their memory as well because that day was so traumatic. Whereas somebody like myself who lived in Las Vegas at the time, I remember every second of that day. In fact, it's like yesterday, but I did not suffer the same kind of trauma that those people who were on the scene did. Furthermore, everything that wasn't found by the Coast Guard is exactly what Jeff said shouldn't be found. Wetsuits, BCDs, among other equipment. He claimed that the 3 other men had those things on. They were wearing them. The men weren't found, and neither were those items, so that kind of goes in line with what Jeff has said since 1994. I further ask, is it plausible that Wandich cooked up the story while he was on that tower for however long, and his story just happened to go along with what could be discovered by the Coast Guard afterwards? And I remind you, he was on that tower, but he couldn't have been sure if he was ever going to be rescued. In fact, you could say that he was rescued alive is a little bit of luck. So would he have been sitting there on that tower, fearing that he might not get rescued, that he might die on that tower, but on the other hand, at the same time, trying to concoct, I guess what you'd call a lie in his head, if he was rescued? That's just a little hard to imagine to me. Fearing that you're going to die and concocting a lie if you're discovered alive seem like the polar opposites of thinking. I think that you'd be one way or the other. In summation, being that I'm playing Jeff Wandich's defense attorney for this episode, Jeff was the one who was experienced. He was the experienced boater. He was the experienced diver. The 3 others were not. And it very well could be that they all went into that water, and once they started swimming toward that light tower, that Jeff, although it seems maybe for a second he kind of lost his head, lost his confidence, but he regained it back and managed to swim to that tower, while the other 3, not being as experienced, started to panic, and they might have made a rash decision that caused them to drown in the Gulf, and that's the reason that they were never found. Also, regarding how the boat sank, it's very possible, given that the boat seemed to have had a problem before they even left the marina, this issue of the engine overheating, that there was some other problem with the boat that was not obvious until they got out there. They went down into the water, and then minutes later, the boat starts to sink. Just because the boat ended up at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and that David, Kent, and Omar were never found does not mean that something suspicious happened. It very well could have been that the boat sank for a very good reason, even though that reason could not be determined once the siesta was brought back to the surface. To conclude this summation and my defense of Jeff Wandich and his story, what are we saying here? Are we saying that Jeff Wandich murdered Kent, David, and Omar? That's the only reason that I could come up with that he would ever lie about what happened out there. Anything else would be an accident, and that's exactly how he has explained what happened on November 4th, 1994. And it's a little hard to understand why he would want to get rid of those three other men since they were all friends. They planned this trip together. They went out in the Gulf together. They agreed to go fishing and scuba diving together. Then he turns around and gets rid of those three. Even a scenario where somebody else did something to David, Omar, and Kent, and Jeff has been ordered or blackmailed to keep it quiet all these years. It's been over 20 years. Not even the mafia has that kind of loyalty. And that concludes my defense of Jeff Wandich and his story as to what happened on November 4th, 1994. I now leave the investigation in your hands. What do you think happened? Is there anything in Jeff's story to this point that makes you feel like it is believable or unbelievable? Because next week, as I told you, you'll be hearing from Bill Medot again. You're going to find out some other things have been discovered. You're going to hear about some of the facts I personally discovered on my own about diving the Baja California, about boat GPS, and an important boating requirement that could play into this case that Bill had never heard about until I discovered it, and it may have played a factor in the actual sinking of the boat. But all of that will be next week as we continue to discuss Vanished in the Gulf. David Medot, Kent Monroe, Omar Shearer, and Jeff Wandich were young Canadian men who were on vacation in Florida. On the morning of November 4th, 1994, they set out from Marco Island into the Gulf of Mexico in Jeff's boat, the Siesta, for a day of fishing and scuba diving. 48 hours later, Wandich was found stranded on a military light tower, the boat had sunk, and the other three men were never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. I start off this episode with a recommendation. If you are a first-time listener to Unfound, first of all, thank you for finding the program. Your listenership is greatly appreciated, and I hope you keep coming back every week, every Friday, to see what case Unfound is going to cover. But please understand, this is part 2 of a case we started on the previous episode of Unfound. And it's probably a poor place to start in getting to know both Unfound and this particular case. I would humbly suggest that you go back and start with part 1 and then come back to this episode, or find some of the other episodes that Unfound already has out. There's over 30 of them. Start there and then come back to part 1. And once again, I thank you for finding Unfound. For everyone else, this continues our examination into the official story Jeff Wandich told the Coast Guard, the families, and other entities regarding the disappearances of David Medot, Kent Monroe, and Omar Shearer on November 4th, 1994 in the Gulf of Mexico. We are going to continue to try to figure out if Jeff Wandich is a reliable narrator or not regarding this incident. And in the last episode, you heard my defense of his account of what happened back in 1994. In this episode, you're going to hear the other side, the prosecution side, as I try to make the case that Jeff's story doesn't quite make sense. And this is going to start with my continued interview with Bill Medot, the father of David Medot. Then after that interview, you'll hear me go through those points that may undermine the story Jeff Wandich told. I will do this from 3 different angles: historical precedent, general knowledge regarding boating and scuba diving, some info of which I discovered on my own. Thus, this is info that has never been heard anywhere else over the last 23 years regarding this case. And number 3, Jeff Wandich's on-the-record words to the media at that time in 1994. In the end, I'm not going to give you my opinion of what happened. You are the jury. I'm going to leave it up to you. Unfound news. I want to update you on the disappearance of Robin Abrams. We covered that case last November. If you don't know, earlier this month, the FBI and Illinois State Police were digging up a basement in Joliet, Illinois, in the hopes of finding her remains. I had a chance to talk to Jody Walsh, Robin's sister, and she told me that nothing was found. This is an unfortunate development in this case, but I know that Jody and the rest of Robin's family will not stop until everyone associated with Robin's disappearance are put behind bars. It should be known, though, the Will County Sheriff's Office was barred from assisting in this dig. You can read into that whatever you'd like. The new season of Disappeared has started. I've seen the list of cases, and there are several that I frankly know nothing about, so I'm looking forward to watching them. However, one of the episodes, and this might be of interest to all of you, concerns the disappearance of Eric Franks, a case we recently covered on Unfound. This will be the first time that we've covered a case on Unfound and then it gets on Disappeared, whereas we've already covered a couple cases on Unfound that were already on Disappeared in previous years, the disappearance of Suzanne Lau being an example of that. And yes, I'm very curious to see how Disappeared covers the disappearance of Eric Franks, given that case's complexities and many details. Finally, in a few weeks, Unfound will be covering a case where the main suspect in a disappearance is getting out of jail. He's been in there 15 years on charges not related to that disappearance. So that episode will not just be a chance to get the word out if someone knows something about this missing persons case, but it will also let everyone know that a very dangerous man is back out on the streets, a man who has never answered for the murder he probably committed. Where you can find Unfound. You can find the program on Twitter at Unfound Podcast. You can find the program on Instagram also at Unfound Podcast. You can find this podcast on Facebook, the Unfound Podcast discussion group. It's a private group, kind of like a club. You can join the conversation there. We'll gladly let you inside. You can find Unfound at Podomatic and iTunes. And thank you all for the nice recent reviews. You can email the program unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. And then please mention Unfound at all of the popular true crime locations, including Reddit, WebSleuths, podcasts we listen to, and all other true crime websites and forums. Bill Medot, father of David Medot, joins us again on Unfound. Bill, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks for having me back.
I want to talk to you about this book, Vanished in the Gulf, which is a detailed account of the disappearances of your son David, Kent Monroe, and Omar Shearer. How did that all get started?
Well, it was a confluence of objectives, I guess. A couple things happened. While we were in Florida, and this was unfolding, the Toronto Sun newspaper sent a reporter down to cover it, and his name was Joe Warmington. Very good, very sharp guy. And he came down and he was issuing reports from here and looking at all the information that came up. And after a few weeks or several weeks of doing this, it struck to him that he felt he wanted to write a book about this because it was a mystery. And there might be a way to help us get some information or get some answers or whatever. At the same time, I was back in Toronto, in Mississauga, which is next to Toronto where we live. And of course, I was still working on this. We still didn't have our boys back. We didn't know where they were. We're trying to do what we could. And I was doing things like hiring private investigators, investigating satellite data, talking to psychics, you name it, I was doing it to try and get some information. And one of the things I was trying to do was kind of the thing we're doing now. I wanted to get some exposure on the media, maybe on TV, et cetera, like $1 Million Mysteries or whatever. And of course, there's a million people trying to get on these shows, and I felt that what I needed was some legitimacy. In other words, I had to write a brief with enough good facts in it. And I'm thinking to myself, because I'm back working, when am I going to have time to write a 50-page brief? And then all of a sudden, Joe's on the picture asking for my help in doing a book. And I'm thinking, hey, this book may just solve my problem. So anyways, it did. And Joe and I became partners on the book. And the book was created. And therefore, thereafter, it's the vehicle that I've used to talk to people about this.
And what was the premise of the book? I know it was to get word out about this disappearance, but was it also to put the facts in a place where everybody can access them so some scrutiny could be given to Jeff Wandich's story?
Well, yeah, that was exactly it. Because, a lot of theories, a lot of comments came up, a lot of theories people had. You should do this, you should do that, maybe this, maybe that, etc. So this was a way of putting it all into one place, because there's a lot of smart people out there. People see things different ways, and maybe being presented with the same fact, someone will see a different twist, whatever. So there's that. They may come up with an idea. Number two, someone might discover that they know something. Hey, I found a BCD around that time somewhere, or whatever, or, that sort of thing. So that, and my own purposes, like to publicize this. So that's how all the objectives we had.
How long did it take to put this book together? And during the writing of it, were there any revelations that you two came upon? Sometimes that happens when you put words to paper. And how did you and Joe work together?
Well, it was really great because we were both, back in Toronto, and we would meet and discuss things. And, I said to Joe, hey, let's try very hard to present the facts, present the truth as we know it, and let other people who look at it decide what they're going to take away from it. We're not accusing, we're not favoring one theory over another. It's just a mystery. So let's do that. And I think it took us, 4 or 5 months. There's a lot to producing a book. You got to write it. Then you got to have typeset a certain way. Then you got to get a publisher, and then this and that, then a distributor. I learned a lot about the book business. Let me tell you, it's a good way to lose money. But nonetheless, we got it done in 4 or 5 months out the door. And so that was a great relief.
Did Joe Warrington decide to do this book? Were his motivations much like yours were, that there seemed to be something that didn't add up in all of this?
Well, he had his suspicions, you might say, clearer, faster than I had. We were sort of along similar lines of questions and issues and things to do. But yeah, he was very fast off the mark on that and really wanted to push ahead.
So what were some of the sources used for this book? Obviously, the reporting that Joe he himself did, the words of Jeff Wandich, statements from the Coast Guard. What else was put into this book?
Yeah. Well, you see, Joe had interviewed a lot of people, like the mechanic at the marina that fixed the boat and the salvager, etc. So he had interviews with these type of people. I had talked with the Coast Guard. I had talked with different private investigators I had who were searching out different things. So I had a lot of stuff there. Plus, I was talking, I knew a lot about the families at this point because I'd lived with them for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And so, yeah, we were able to sort of combine it that way. Yeah.
And were you pleased with the final product? You were gracious enough to send me a copy. I read it. I enjoyed it. I found it to be very informative. It helped me a lot in understanding what happened back in November 4th of 1994. But also, if you were to write that book again now, would it be different?
I don't know that we'd be different, because I think, and I've reviewed it recently, I think Joe did a good job of, based on the objectives that we had. And I don't know there's that much more you can do, because what we really need is more facts, right?
Yeah.
That's what we really need, some new fact, because we're just machining, facts or guesses that we have to date, and that hasn't moved us along. I mean, since then, if I want to add something to the book, I've had sometimes anonymous notes from people about different things. Look here, look there, check out this, check out that. But it's pretty tough when you can't get back to those people, right? And especially when people take care to not leave fingerprints on their envelope and not sign their name, etc. So, there's a few things like that. A few psychics have been involved with, which was, an interesting experience of what they said, things like that. And different other groups that, like missionaries that I got in contact with, because there was, some thought that, hey, maybe these kids wind up in Central America or so, I mean, how do you find out what's going on there?
Although his name came up several times in part one, we have not talked about him alone. What can you tell the listeners about Jeff Wandich? What did you know about him back then?
Well, let me go back to the time. At the time, of course, I knew nothing about Jeff Wandich other than he belonged to this Wandich family that David was going to see. I know him as the son of a very wealthy man who at that time was a real estate developer, and that's they had this nice place in Marco, and he worked for his father. He worked looking after, I think, maintenance in some of the apartment buildings, etc. And that's really basically all I know about the guy. He seemed to spend a lot of time in Florida. I think there had been times he's actually lived and worked in Florida. So I'm not sure exactly, how that working relationship worked out. I do know that he apparently was a master diver, or had all his driving credentials. He's had that boat, the Siesta, for a long time. Apparently was in very good shape, and he took good care of it from what I could determine. So really, that's the sum of it. Yeah.
And to reiterate something from part one, Jeff Wandich is the lone survivor in this incident that caused the disappearance of David Medott, Kent Monroe, and Omar Shearer.
Right.
And everything that was detailed in part one of this program comes from the recollection of Jeff Wandich, what he remembered about going out there on November 4th and the next 48 hours. But frankly, the reason you and I are talking is because you still have some suspicions and concerns about what happened back then, almost 23 years ago, what happened on November 4th. Let's talk about some of those suspicions that you have.
Well, let's look at the total picture. The big mystery is, why did we not find anything, any trace? Given, and we assume as true, we take as true, these guys had these BCDs on, they're on top of the water, we know where they started, we know the current plan, why didn't we find them? And there's a bunch of theories. So let me rule out one quick one is, some spacemen came and took the kids. So let me get rid of that. But then we'll have people say, well, hey, sharks ate these kids. That's why you didn't find them. So again, this is a path you go down. You start calling experts in sharks and experts in this area in sharks and say, is this likely? Would a shark eat a person? Eat three people? Could that happen? And then the answer becomes, well, that's not likely. A shark around here may bite somebody. It may bite a limb, but they won't consume the BCD and the whole body and all three bodies, and there'll be debris, right? So that's back to, hey, we didn't find any debris. So then you say another thing is, well, suppose these guys are floating along and it's night and they float into something else, like some guy's doing a drug deal. And these guys say, hey, there's some witnesses here. What do we do with them? Pull them in the boat? No, what do? Take them somewhere? This is the Central America, Mexico thing. Take them there, kill them, bury them. Could that have happened? That's why you didn't find anything, because they're not there anymore. So that's a possibility. And to that end, I spent a lot of time and effort trying to get to different bodies like the NSA, CIA, whatever, to find satellite data to see if we could see boats that went through that area at that time or whatever. And anyways, we came out dry. So whether there was information or not, I don't know. But we did put a lot of pressure on people, even got some diplomats in Canada to go a formal route and request satellite stuff. So that one is still kind of open. So then the other theory is, well, we didn't find them because they were never there. So something happened somewhere else. Well, now this is another thing, and many people have brought this up. Of course, that gives Jeff, a problem, because that says either he doesn't remember something, like maybe he's got PTSD or something like that, or he doesn't want to say something. So people have suggested that. And is that viable or not? Well, I don't know. That's why I want facts on the table and other people to look at it, because I'm very close to it. And I don't want to be in a position of I'm going to grasp for a straw or look for a culprit, if you will, just to satisfy myself. What I really want is the truth. Okay? So if you go down each one of those paths, there's questions you ask. And as you go down the Jeff path, people have asked questions about, the story that he's related. So
the first interesting point you ever made with me had to do with the boat being on the surface of the water right above the Baja California while David and Jeff were scuba diving on the bottom. What can you tell the listeners about that?
Yeah, like one thing that someone had mentioned was that we hired, by the way, I hired an ex-FBI guy by the name of Joe Creeling, a wonderful man, to go out over that site and dive it a couple of times, a few weeks later after this. And then he went down there and they found a toolbox and fishing rods from Jeff's boat, right down there on top of the boat. And so someone said to me, well, didn't these guys see all this stuff falling down off the boat? And I said, I don't know. I asked the question and the answer was no, we didn't see it. But that was something that struck somebody as being, hey, wouldn't they have seen these items falling down through the water? So that was that one.
Yes, that struck me strange back when you told me that back in January, and it strikes me as strange now. What can you tell the listeners about the flares on the boat?
Well, one of the ways out of this, or to get help, would be to send a flare up if you could. And there was 2 flare packages, if you will, or kits on the boat. And they were in the console of this boat. So if you can picture, you have this boat 22 feet long. Right in the very center of the boat is where the steering wheel is, where the driver stands. So I guess that's sort of 8 or 10 feet from the point of the bow. And there's a console underneath that where the flares are. So now when the boat is submerged in water with only 3 feet of it sticking up, the chances are the flares are still there. So when I asked about getting the flares, I was told that my son David was told, go down and see if there are any flares there. Well, he went down, came back, said, I didn't find any. But it seemed a little strange that maybe, the guy who owned the boat, who knew the boat, who knew every nook and cranny on the boat, wouldn't go down and try and, find his stuff. I mean, may have had other tools and things, on this boat that he knew where they were and no one else did, right? But anyways, it was one attempt to to look for flares, and that was given up after that when you didn't find it.
If the listeners will remember back to part 1, you remember that Jeff asked or ordered David to go back into the boat underneath the water and release the bait fish, fearing that the small fish would bring bigger fish. And then David was expected to go back down again to find the flares. Well, when the boat was finally brought back to the surface by the salvager, the flares were found exactly in the place where they were supposed to be, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. So that was, disappointing to know that in that circumstance. Also, for what it's worth, in front of the center console, apparently so this would be about 6 feet down, there was a cooler. Cooler had a case of beer in there. So it just seems a little strange that someone would have said, hey, let's go down and get a few beers. We can't drink seawater, right? But let's put a beer in the pocket of our BCDs, and if we need it, drink a beer. So these kind of things, people have asked questions. There's people maybe smarter than me saying, well, why didn't they do that? And I said, I don't know. It just seems logical.
In going on this trip, Jeff portrayed himself as an experienced boater and diver to your son David, to Kent, and to Omar. But there are some things that show that maybe Jeff wasn't as experienced as he portrayed himself to be. What can you say about that?
Well, again, someone pointed out to me saying, well, normally when people dive, especially if you're way out in the water doing a deep dive, it's apparently, I don't know if it's a law, but it's certainly a standard rule that you always have somebody in the boat. So divers go off the boat, but there's always somebody on the top up there, and this didn't happen here. They all went off the boat. So not only did they all go off the boat, but at least 2 of the guys were kind of like new divers, if you know what I mean, like really not proven at that depth. So that seemed to be kind of a risk, that one would take, and seemed very, very strange. And the other thing that's concerning is, from all I could see, the boat was in good repair. I mean, they had this issue with the motor, or whatever it was, overheating, but of course the motors are off at this point, and apparently it was fixed. Apparently they had been fishing for an hour, and the boat didn't sink, okay? And then they go down, and I know Jeff has told me that he could see the bilge pumps pumping water out of the boat. So everything seems to be okay, and then 2 of these guys are off the boat for probably no more than 5 to 7 minutes, and the boat's suddenly sinking. Like, that doesn't make sense.
For the record, and even though the boat was salvaged, brought back to the surface, we still don't know why the boat sank.
Exactly. So these are kind of nagging little questions. If you had an answer to, you'd feel better, or maybe it would leave you to somewhere. So, and these are the types of things people are brought up to me, and I think Joe pointed them out in the book, and like, I can't prove them or disprove them or say they're relevant or not. And I know that Jeff has felt a lot of heat on this and has been very concerned, about how he's been portrayed, but I guess we just don't know the answer.
The listeners should know that a writer came down to the Gulf of Mexico, went out into the Gulf of Mexico, went out to the area of the Baja California on a boat, did some experimentation, and his conclusion was that the boat sank because it was overloaded, meaning when Kent and Omar got back onto the boat on the stern, the engines were too big for the boat. The 2 engines were too heavy for the boat in the first place. And with 2 men being on the back of the boat, that's what brought the stern back into the water, thus flooding it. What can you say about that?
Yeah, he said that. And in other words, he could rationalize, all this thing happening. And, and a few other people have. But there's been a lot of other people who've rationalized it the other way. So the thing is, I don't know what the answer is. Yeah, it's possible, I guess. Okay. But when you add it all up, say, yeah, I can rationalize that you could have these heavy motors on the boat. I can rationalize that maybe some water comes in. But how come it all comes in to sink the boat in 5 or 7 minutes? And then on top of that, how come it gets sunk, and yet we got these guys with BCD's eye on them, and we never find a piece of them or any of them, but we find all kinds of other debris for the boat. When you add all these things up, you've got probabilities times probabilities times probabilities. Seems to me it gets pretty minuscule sometimes.
While we're at it, what happened to the Siesta? Did the Wandages get it back? Was it sold? Do you remember what happened to it? Do you even know?
I don't know. I don't think Jeff got it back, because I think what happened was when the guy, salvager, took the boat, he wanted to quite a big fee from the Wandages to get the boat back, and also a big fee to repair and clean the motors. And I don't know what happened after that. I heard that they walked away, but I'm not sure.
Listeners should know that I live in a boating community, which is Madeira Beach in Florida. My landlords have taken part in fishing contests in their own boat that's very similar to the Siesta, gone far out into the Gulf of Mexico, and I've had a chance to talk to them about this story. In fact, one of my landlords, Red, vanished in the Gulf. We discovered some things about the anchor. We discovered some things about the anchor line. Let's talk a little bit about that, Bill. Starting with, are we sure the anchor was attached to the bow of the Siesta?
Yes, that's what I was told, and I believe that's what the people said after it was salvaged. Yeah, there was it was anchored to the bow, and you might recall in the previous session, I'd mentioned to you that apparently if a boat is on the bottom of the water out in international waters and it's not anchored, anyone can salvage it. So when the salvager brought the boat up, the anchor line, there was no anchor at the end of the anchor line, right? Or the anchor line was frayed, as they said. So, but it was tied to the front of the bow. Yeah, I mean, if it had been to the back, to the stern, that would be the first thing they said. Aha, that's it. You could now see that it would sink if it was anchored from the stern.
Something that I discovered, and I found this out from a couple different sources put together, one both from my landlord, who once again has been a boat owner for 30 years on the Gulf of Mexico, and from a couple boating forums online, is that the Siesta only had 300 feet of anchor rope. Well, the ratio that a boater's supposed to have going out into deep water is 4-to-1. So the Siesta should have had at least 400 feet of rope to anchor in 100 feet of water. And in fact, to be safe, you're supposed to be 6-to-1. So the Siesta should have had 600 feet of rope attached to the anchor, not 300. And that may have factored into its sinking, possibly. You were a little surprised to find that out, weren't you, Bill? You didn't know that.
Yeah, of course. Not being a boater, I had no idea. So it's interesting rule and note. I guess goes by depth, 6-to-1. I didn't know that. No.
What was Jeff's attitude toward you, the families, and the media after this all happened?
Well, I guess it's easy when you're an armchair quarterback like I am, and I want to be fair to everybody. So Jeff had this situation, this event, this trauma, if you will. So I have no idea what it's like to go through, what he says happened, and whether you have PTSD or something else. But certainly, after he had this and he was sort of recovering, then a lot of people came asking these types of questions. Jeff, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? Jeff, did you abandon your friends, etc.? And this concerned him a lot. He was really concerned, and so was his family. I can understand that. It's not true, it's not a good thing to say. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is this concerned him, and he I think to the point where he became very concise or, just sort of wanted to get away from it all, etc. And therefore, after that, when I talked to him, there was this cloud hanging over. I met with him, tried to meet with him a couple of times to get some more facts, but I always felt like there was this cloud hanging over, like he thought maybe I was trying to nail him or catch him up or something like that. So the sessions weren't as good as I had hoped.
In part one, I had asked you if Jeff took part in the search that took place after he was discovered. You had talked to a boat captain on one of the ships that Jeff had been on during the search. What did that captain have to say? In fact, he came and found you.
Yeah, he came and said, I don't know if this bothers me. I don't know if it's important. He said, but, I had Jeff out on my boat with me, and I didn't feel he was spending a lot of time looking. And halfway through the tour, he decided to go home. So he said, that just bothered me for, a person who's lost 3 friends. So, I could look at the other side and say, yeah, it would bother me too. But on the other hand, I have no idea what condition the guy was in. Like, this is 3-4 days after, emotions all over the place, etc. So all I'm saying is, somebody else said that to me, so I relayed that to you.
At one point in part one, you were describing what happened on November 4th, 1994, and of course you're just using the story that Jeff Wondich told after he was discovered. You had made it sound like he had changed his story. He told one story to one person regarding a small part of that, the overall narrative, and then later he changed part of that story to something else. Over the years, has his story changed?
Not that I'm aware, although I have not, heard of him retelling or, again, being, re-going through this with somebody else again. So I can't say that it's changed. You can see there was not a copious amount of detail, to begin with, and nothing has changed from what I can see.
Going back to that time after Jeff was rescued, because I know you haven't talked to him recently, did he ever convey to you what the topic of conversation was while the 4 of them were in that water after the boat sank?
Yeah, yes, he did. There were some very brief comments. I said, what did you guys talk about? And he said, oh, well, we talked about, how this would be something to tell our kids and how we were going to be friends forever, etc. And I was looking for something. I was expecting to hear, messages from each one, because they're all probably thinking, hey, I might not make this, so, tell my mom I love her kind of a thing. Or, and I didn't hear any of that. So maybe they were scared and he didn't want to relate that to me or what. I just thought it strange that I really didn't get too much of a personal comments out of this thing for guys that were sort of in the water for 4 hours together.
Have you kept in contact with Joe Warrington since he wrote this book? Do you still talk to him to this day?
No, I talk to Joe every now and then, but it's more a friendship as opposed to talking about the case, sort of a thing.
And does he still keep tabs on this case? Does he have any intentions of going back to it, or do you think that it's more likely that he has moved on?
I think he's moved on. I think he has a real interest, if you will, or soft spot for this story, but he needs some fact to move.
Bill, what do you think happened to David, Kent, and Omar?
Well, it's tough to point it down, and I certainly don't want to bias your audience. I just keep coming back to saying these guys disappeared. It seems very, very strange. How could they disappear? Okay, there's something that we don't know, and I'd like to get a clue, one direction or another. So we would know something. it's useless for me to speculate because I don't have facts to say, yes, I think this happened or that happened.
Then let me put it this way. Given the story that Jeff Wandich told you back in 1994, you fully expected for your son David, for Ken and Omar to be found alive.
Absolutely. Given the circumstances and the inputs I was getting from various people, it was certainly very positive for the first little while.
How has this affected you and your family?
Well, it's had a very profound effect. We're a close-knit family. Dave was a key member. His brothers looked up to him. My wife, she loves all her kids, but she loved Dave as well. And it's been an adjustment. I mean, it never leaves you. I mean, you have to go on, and we're very fortunate that we've had good friends and relatives to support us, and we have to move on for the sake of others. But yeah, it's a life-changing event. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
And how many other children do you have, Bill?
I have two other boys, Matthew and Danny.
And was David the oldest?
David was the oldest, yes.
And how do you think this has affected your two other sons?
Well, I guess that would be up to them to say, but I know Danny has always been a sort of a man of a few words, but I think he leaned on Dave quite a bit, and I know for about a year after Dave was missing, Danny was just sort of off in another world. He left home for a while, etc. And the good news is now he's married, has children, doing very well, working for TD Ameritrade. And Matt was really a buddy of Dave's, and much so that Dave would take him out to his university for a weekend with him, when Matt was still in high school. And he lost a good friend. He lost a real good friend, an advisor. So yeah, we've all sort of, it's in another way, it's brought us all closer together, I guess.
Do you keep in contact with anybody in Kent Monroe or Omar Shear's family?
Not really. I occasionally see Omar's mother and his sister, once every year or so, around. But no, we don't sort of get together or talk about this thing. Monroe's, I believe, may have passed away. So, yeah.
So you are the one who is the advocate, not just for your son, but for Kent and Omar as well. In a sense, you're representing all of the families, I guess.
I'm only representing a sense of, they're part of this story. They who knows what they want to do, whether they want to make a comment or not, or give it up. I just know it's always with me.
Obviously, there's the book Vanished in the Gulf by Joe Warrington, which can be found on Amazon.com. But where can people find you online? Your website, your email, any other information you want to give out?
Yeah, the website is www.vanish.org, which has got a lot of articles and stuff on there. And if anyone wanted to contact me, they can just Google me. Don't go to the address that's in the website. It's not working. But they can. I'm wmadot@hotmail.com, so I'm pretty easy to get a hold of.
What I'm hoping, Bill, is that there are experienced boaters and scuba divers in this audience that can contact you and offer their opinion about this disappearance. As everybody knows, I live right on the Gulf. I know about a lot of disappearances that have happened in these waters. This is a unique one, very unique, and I'm hoping there are people with experience that can offer some new insight into it.
Okay, well, thank you.
Bill, thank you for being on Unfound, and I hope we can keep in touch with each other.
Okay, I look forward to that, Ed. Thank you.
And that was my early 2017 interview with Bill Madot, father of Dave Madot. I continue to thank him for joining me and all of you on that episode way back then. If you're interested, the book Vanished in the Gulf can be found on Amazon. but it is not cheap. So if you'd like to get a copy, probably for cheaper, email me and I will contact Bill directly about your interest. To go back to the original coverage in 2017, I presented it as a kind of trial. I don't think that I've ever done that with any other disappearance that has been featured on Unfound. In the first half, I was the prosecution against Jeff Wandich, meaning I presented the flaws in his story. Then in the second half, I presented my defense of Jeff Wandich, in which I tried to show that his story is believable. I'm not doing that today, so you'll have to go back to the original episode to decide which of my arguments was more persuasive. So then, what can be said here in 2025? A new thought that came to my mind while putting this episode together is how if all 4 of these Canadian men disappeared, we would not be thinking anything other than an accident. The boat would have been found at the bottom of the Gulf, and that would have been that. In fact, Unfound now has a good example of this, coincidentally with young Canadian men going missing. That would be the Pickering Six, the half-dozen men who seemingly went out on Lake Erie and never returned. To be fair, there are people who think foul play occurred in that case. To me, those arguments are thin. But I will admit, had one of those 6 survived and had a story like Jeff Wandich's, I have to admit that I would have a hard time believing 100% that it was an accident. So really, with Jeff Wandich, the main question is this. If we were in his shoes, and it was some kind of foul play or accident caused by Jeff, or even something that was on purpose by Jeff, if we were in his shoes, would each of our stories be like his? If we were in a position where we had to make sure nobody ever found out what happened, would we tell the Jeff Wandich story regarding how he swam to the buoy, etc.? I will leave that question to be answered in the privacy of your own podcast listening area. The other part of this summation is, if Dave, Omar, and Kent floated away, why weren't they found if they had scuba equipment which would have kept them afloat? This is how their disappearances are different from the Pickering Six, because nobody, even the people who think it was an accident there in Pickering, believes those 6 men went in that boat in Lake Erie with life jackets or anything else. Thus, this makes it more likely that they drowned and never came back to the surface. Or if they did so in a place in the water where no one would have looked. This would also be true for the disappearance of J.R. Mollahan, who might have gone into the Atlantic, and Tiffany Daniels, who might have disappeared in the Gulf. Nobody believes these 2, if they went into the water, had any flotation devices whatsoever. For Dave, Kent, and Omar, the belief is the opposite. Even from Jeff Wandich's own words, he claims they had scuba equipment on, so I guess we should believe him. What I mean by that is, if he's trying to get away with murder or something, would it not be better for Jeff to have told investigators that the 3 had no flotation devices when they disappeared? Why? Because this would then thoroughly explain why the 3 were never found, and nobody would be suspicious of Jeff. That Jeff told the Coast Guard that the 3 had scuba equipment makes us all question why they weren't found and makes Jeff look suspicious. Why would he do that to himself? Thus, this is why I might just have to believe the scuba equipment story. Don't get me wrong, though. This case still could be foul play. To further this thinking on this topic, then since the sinking location was known, the water current direction was known, the water current speed was known, and on top of that, the searching started fairly quickly, then why were not even one of these men found, even if one of them were dead? Hard to understand? Yes, but it's just circumstantial. The really tough part is if Jeff is telling the truth, then this is a guy who saw his friends die, although he didn't necessarily see their deaths, and he could do nothing about it. And we may be suspicious of a guy who actually did nothing wrong. My final point is this case is probably one of the most 50-50 disappearances Unfound has featured. On one hand, there are many reasons to think the public story is not true. On the other hand, we know diving accidents happen. We know many of them can be bizarre in the improbability of them occurring, but they happen anyway. And once again, if we have any diving instructors and professionals in the audience, I'd like to hear your insights on these disappearances. If you'd like to hear and read more of my in-depth analysis into the disappearance of the Marco Island 3, please go to patreon.com/Unfound Podcast, sign up, and partake in the Unfound blog. Until then, I leave the public theorizing up to you. And that's the program. I'm Ed Dunsel, and you've been listening to Unfound.